You were hearing this from childhood in your home, the focus on civil rights, human rights, what about conversation about politics and involvement in the political process?
My brother, my sister, who's now gone, and I at the dinner table every night, because we always waited for our dad for dinner. That was a given. We all ate together.
Yeah.
Politics was a major subject of discussion, and my parents loved Roosevelt, and loved the New Deal, and also they made us feel like they wanted to hear from us as kids. Okay. And it's very important that parents do that they let their kids know that their ideas and their views are relevant and important. And our parents made us feel as though our ideas and our thoughts counted. I don't know if they were gibberish or whether they were rational or not, but they made us feel as though they wanted to hear our points of view. And just to finish one thought, before when I said that my mother would have thought we could do anything because that was the kind of mother she was, she also didn't particularly push us into politics at all. She was kind of a private person. Mm-hmm. My dad was a kind of a public person who would have pressed us to go into public life and government. But my mother, although she would think we could do anything we wanted to do, actually, when she was asked by a reporter after Sandy and I were in the Congress how proud she must be, I think the reporter said, "You must be bursting your buttons with pride to have your two sons in the U.S. Congress." And her answer was, "If that's what they want, it's okay with me."
You went through Detroit Public Schools, then you went east, Swarthmore and Harvard Law School, and you came back. Did you know or think when I finish high school, I'm going to go on and get my law degree, I'm going to stay involved in the public, or get involved in the public sector? What was your transition?
I always assumed I'd be a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought I would do something. In fact, when I started to practice law, I was in private practice for a couple of years, and I was happy. So I never aimed at being in government in some way or in public life. But when Fikens and Keith, the two judges, came and said that they'd like me to be their general counsel at the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, and when Attorney General Kelly put me on his staff so I could do that, that struck a positive bell with me. The civil rights movement was just really beginning. It was an important movement, and I wanted to be a part of it, and that's the way I was a part of it. But in terms of running for office, that is something I never thought particularly I would do. As I mentioned, my brother ran in the 60s, and it wasn't really until the riot came in 67 that I was persuaded by people in Detroit to run for city council. The city was really hurting, divided. I had been not just only the Civil Rights Commission attorney, but then for a couple years I helped to open the Defender's Office in Detroit. So we represented indigents in Detroit. And that came about a year before the riot started.
That was a city office?
No, that was a new office the Bar Association created. Actually, it's called the Defender's Office. So I started the Michigan Civil Rights Commission from 64 roughly to 67, I believe, early. Then before the riot, I became an attorney for I helped to create the Defender's Office in Detroit, and I headed the appellate section of the Defender's Office, so I represented indigents on appeal who did not have lawyers. We were appointed by the court.
That's what we know today as the State Appellate Defender's
Office. It is,
Office.
exactly right.
But it then was a bar creation.
It was called the Legal Aid and Defender's Office of Detroit. That's what it was called. But it was started by the Bar Association. But that led to the State Appellate Defender's Office, which is a successor of the appellate division there. Anyway, the riot came then, and people thought that the city needed healers, people who could unify the city, bring together the city, and that because of my activity, particularly on the Civil Rights Commission, I would get, they believed, strong support in the both white and African American communities, so I could be somebody who might be able to help bring together the city.
You had been involved in the with the Civil Rights Commission on issues, civil rights issues, and so on. But now people were encouraging you to become active in the political process at that time.
It was in '67 when the riot took place, but it wasn't until maybe late '68 or '69, early, that people came to me and said, hey, you ought to run for city council. So that was something I would have decided to do maybe just a few months probably before I actually ran in '69, which would have been November of '69, and then elected. And then, of course, I left the defender's office. I left the defender's office, and then immediately went on the city council.
You said there were particular cases that were key, setting precedent with the Civil Rights Commission. Then, as we look at Detroit at that time, the racial unrest was very clear. Almost
it was racial division. It really wasn't so much unrest as it was division. Unrest was an earlier riot in the late '40s, which was really a race riot. This was not really a race riot in '67. This was a riot as it took place around the country, actually, after the killings of let's see, in 1967, I think that was it was King then who was killed in '67, I believe. And that set off some riots, but it was not, it's kind of it's an important difference, but it's kind of hard to describe without kind of sounding the way I don't want to sound. I remember our neighborhood was a very integrated neighborhood. We lived in Northwest Detroit. We raised our kids there, and there was no fear. There was no racial fear in our neighborhoods. They were all just about integrated by then in Detroit. Either that or they were exclusively African American, but where the white community, for the most part, lived were in integrated neighborhoods in Detroit. And there was no fear, I would say, at that time at all between the races inside of our integrated neighborhoods. I remember we were watching the looting on Livernois Avenue with African American neighbors, white neighbors, just standing on the other side of Livernois, just looking at, watching together. But there were not whites and blacks going after each other the way there was 20 years earlier.
The makeup of city government at that time, there never had been an African American serve as mayor of Detroit. Was
a white
Nick Hood
mayor.
the only African American?
No, Tyndall. Bob Tyndall was there.
Yeah, okay.
And it was a white mayor, Roman Gribbs. My first term, when I was on the council, not yet president of the council.
That's right. That first 4 years, Gibbs was mayor during your first term, right?
Gribbs, yeah, Ray Gribbs. Ray Gribbs was the mayor, and then the second term, my second term when I came in first in the city.
Right.
So I became president of the city council. That was Coleman Young's first term. He was elected mayor, and I think he beat the police chief, Nichols. I believe. That was in '73. Yes.
Okay.
And the city was becoming more and more African American but during this entire period. Probably was, I'm guessing, 60 or 70% African American, probably in '73.
But you, white guy, got the most votes.
Right, and Nick Hood, an African American, who was also, by the way, on the city council. As you mentioned before that, he came in second, so he was the president pro tem, as we said, and just a terrific human being, a great friend and supporter. It had to be a bit of a disappointment that he was second the first time I ran, and then I jumped ahead of him the second time I ran. But he never let on if he was disappointed. He never let that on. He just was a terrific supporter. And there were still many white members of the city council as well. Where's Becky, Van Antwerp, Eberhard, number of other